We're about 2/3 of the way through this series on how we sanitize scripture, and it is about to get uncomfortable because next up is sex in scripture. Now, I don't do this to glorify sex or to laugh at the sexy bits of the Bible, but because it is important. As Christians, we sometimes have a hard time talking about our bodies, especially when it comes to genitals or sex. We can start to think that our genitals, our bodies, our sexuality are somehow evil because they are something that we keep silent about. And we justify this because we don't see the Bible talking about sex very often. So we take our cue from Scripture. But the Bible talks about sex a ton and about our genitals and how we use them. And some of that talk is quite explicit. We miss it, not because it isn't there, but because we skip those passages. We don't preach from those passages. We ignore them. We miss the imagery because it is from thousands of years ago, or we just plain translate it away in an effort to make the Bible match our sensibilities instead of the other way around. Well, I'm going to talk about it. Sex, our bodies, our genitals are not evil. How we use them is important, yes, and God cares about how we use them a great deal. But silence is not helpful, and the Bible is not silent about it. For crying out loud, the central way to identify one of God's people throughout the entire Old Testament was that they had the foreskins of their penis removed in circumcision. Scripture is no stranger to the importance of our bodies and our sexuality. And it's not anywhere near all condemnation and repression either. That is our silence, not the Bible's. There are times when Scripture outright celebrates our bodies and sex. But this is a big topic, so it will be divided into multiple videos. First is going to be a look at how the Bible talks about genitals and the use of euphemisms in Scripture. Then a video on sex in the Bible, and finally one on ritual prostitution in the Bible. In between, there will be a few studies of specific passages, like why Samson was probably prison raped, and how the book of Ruth is a lot racier and has a lot more gray areas than you probably learned in Sunday school. But any discussion about genitals and sex has to begin with how difficult it is to talk about them, because most of the words for them are euphemisms. Even English's clinical words for our genitals, penis and vagina, are Latin euphemisms. Penis is just the Latin word for tail, and vagina is Latin for a sheath, where a man could put his sword. But euphemisms are problematic because sometimes a tail just means a tail. A sheath sometimes holds an actual sword, and it is the context that tells us the difference between laying down and getting laid. But the less context we have, the harder it is to figure out which is meant. And in Scripture sometimes we have a word that's only mentioned once or twice, so not much context to go on. This is especially true as how people talk about genitals and about sex has changed in the thousands of years since the Bible was written, making it easy for us to miss a penis reference that in the day's context would have been incredibly obvious. The Bible is filled with talk about people knowing their wives or exposing their feet or spreading their cloaks, but we misunderstand them without context. Now, some translations make this a lot worse because they see all mentions of sex as improper and refuse to admit that the Bible can talk about it so bluntly. And so they translate out every reference to sex and sexual organs that they can, which makes the Bible more confusing, less relatable, less accurate, and less helpful, just for the goal of making it more appropriate. Not a fair trade, in my opinion. But talking about sex in Scripture is still a trick because there is a measure of uncertainty where maybe a tail is just a tail. To help show this, every instance in Scripture will get marked on a graph for how vulgar this probably is and how likely it is that it is a euphemism instead of being literally about tails and sheaths. So getting tail would be fairly tame, but almost certainly a euphemism, while chilling might be the Netflix and variety, but probably just means hanging out. Over the next few weeks, I'm going to be digging into these topics, trying to remove some of the silence about sex and our bodies that in our ignorance we have placed on Scripture, and try to find out what of our thinking about sex and our bodies is really God and what is just people trying to make God agree with them. I hope you'll come along for the journey, and sorry about not having a fuller content video this week. This series has taken a lot more time to research than I had anticipated, but I think it'll be worth the wait. As always, thank you for watching. I hope you have a great week. We'll see you next Friday.